Okay, well, hello everyone. Thanks for welcoming. We're really delighted to have Jordana Schiralli here today, who's a doctoral student in psychology in Dr. Alison Chastain's lab, formerly known as the Adult Development Lab, now the Intergroup Relations Lab. And we will hear more about her. She's already published 2 articles and is really interested in different forms of prejudice and stereotyping that we'll hear more of today. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to talk to you today about some research that my supervisor, Allison, and some of her collaborators have been working on for the past few years, looking at older adults' views of aging. Okay, hopefully that is a good sound. Okay. So aging is an identity that we all share. It's an inevitable and biological process that cannot be avoided, even though some people may want to. And if we're all lucky, someday we'll become older adults. However, aging is often viewed quite negatively in the media, such as articles as this one, where older adults are sometimes depicted as incompetent or even childlike. These stereotypes are perpetuated in many different areas of our society. Particularly, it's rampant in the beauty industry with products that claim to reverse aging or eliminate wrinkles or essentially help you appear as though you are younger than perhaps you actually are. These products are especially targeted towards women who are often perceived as losing their social value as they age. And if you actually do a Google search for anti-aging products, what you'll see on almost entirely the first page of Google is all photos of women with maybe only 5 or 6 photos of men. So although some of these products and these views of aging may seem like they're relatively harmless, and we often joke about aging, these views can actually have some harmful consequences. So people who have negative stereotypes about older adults, both younger and older adults included, might perceive older adults as people who are forgetful or frail, lonely, being a burden on others, and many other characteristics. And as I said previously, although it might be pretty common knowledge to have these stereotypes and perceive that they're harmless, they can actually be associated with detriments to older adults. So research has began investigating this question in particular. In 2015, my advisor, Allison Chastain, and her colleagues started looking at the linkage between beliefs and abilities. So specifically, they addressed the question of whether negative views of aging impact self-perceived hearing and memory. And I'll orient you to this structural equation model, and I promise I'll walk you through like what's most important here, because I know it looks a little bit daunting. I'm sorry if the image quality is not great there. But most importantly, what we see here is that negative views of aging, which are on the far left, have a negative correlation with self-perceived memory and self-perceived hearing abilities. So what this means is that older adults who have these negative views about aging and view aging as something that is they're fearful of or to be avoided are more likely to perceive their hearing and memory abilities as being worse, which are then positively correlated with their actual hearing and memory performance. So what this implies is that these negative views of aging could potentially be influencing how older adults are perceiving their abilities and then how their actual abilities are playing out when they're tested on these different domains. One thing I do want to note here, though, is that this is not a causal model and that more longitudinal work is necessary. So it could also be the case that older adults who do have worse memory and worse hearing performance are in tune with perceiving those abilities as not being great and then also having negative views of aging. So it could certainly be the other direction as well. And lastly, one more thing I want to note about this model is you'll notice that age is included on the far right, and it's actually not correlated here with negative views of aging. So it's not just the case that it's the very older adults in our sample that are feeling these negative views in particular. It was all adults in the sample, which I believe ranged from 56 to 96 years old. Okay, so for the present study, we're mainly going to be extending upon and replicating some of the results from the 2015 study. So the first phase of the study was looking at explicit views of aging. So this is just directly asking older adults through self-reporting what their views of aging are with a variety of different measures. And we did this just by administering a survey online to older adults that they completed in their homes, either on their own personal tablet computer or tablet or a desktop computer, sorry. We're also going to be talking about implicit views of aging. So this refers to the second part of the study where some participants were invited into the lab to complete a very wide variety of tasks, including implicit views of aging tasks, where we can get a better sense of the automatic and implicit associations that older adults might have about aging that we are not necessarily able to capture solely at the explicit level. From here, these lines of research have informed our intervention that is currently in the works, looking at how we can target older adults' negative views about aging and hopefully foster more positive beliefs instead. Okay, so we had 451 older adults from the Greater Toronto Area participate in our study. The mean age was about 71 years, and our sample was predominantly women, and they were fairly educated. This sample size in particular is, oh, sorry, things are getting cut off there. This sample size in particular was only relevant for phase 1A, which was the online survey. From there, select older adults were invited into the lab to complete phase 1B, which was an in-lab session where they completed a variety of hearing, vision, memory, cognition tasks, as well as the implicit views of aging tasks. So at first, we were inviting everyone into the lab who completed phase 1A, but at a certain point, we started only inviting individuals who met a certain threshold of having negative views of aging, because those are really the individuals where we want to see if we can potentially intervene. And then phase 2, which is cut off there, was our intervention phase, although that won't be the focus of today's talk. So to take you through some of the explicit measures that are relevant for the analyses that we're about to go through, this is not an exhaustive list by any means. It's just the main measures that you should be familiar with for the next few results. So we looked at essentialist beliefs about aging. So this is the degree to which older adults view aging as something that is fixed rather than malleable. So having this sense that aging is fixed and irreversible is a more essentialist belief. So this would kind of be in line with this idea that aging is, really all downhill from here as you continue to age. We also looked at subjective age. So this refers to how old older adults feel as opposed to their chronological age. So in this artistic depiction here, we have an older adult woman looking into the mirror and seeing a younger version of herself. And research has found a lot of really interesting outcomes associated with subjective age. So on average, people who are 40 years of age or older actually feel about 20% younger than their chronological age. And this is associated with numerous benefits, such as better health outcomes, less depressive symptoms, and many others. We also assessed age stigma consciousness. So this is the degree to which older adults are concerned about being stigmatized due to their older age identity, particularly when interacting with younger adults. We also assessed fear of aging. So this is the degree to which older adults are concerned about aging and worried about the consequences that are associated with aging. Lastly, we looked at awareness of age-related change, and this is a measure that actually has two subscales, so it's awareness of age-related losses and age-related gains. In particular for this work, we've been focusing on the age-related losses, so this would be something like a heightened awareness of the memory declines or cognitive declines that are associated with aging. And in this study in particular, we're looking at essentialist beliefs about aging and subjective age as constructs that can be both predictors and possible outcomes that can be influenced by the negative views of aging constructs, which are age stigma, fear of aging, and awareness of age-related losses. So we had two main research questions with this line of work for this first phase. I'll focus on the first question to start. So here we're looking at how do older adults' essentialist beliefs about aging and their subjective age relate to their views of aging. So here specifically we're looking at subjective age as a mediator that can potentially influence the negative views of aging that older adults might have. So for our analytic approach, we used the process macro and SPSS developed by Hayes. And if you're unfamiliar with it, it's essentially just a tool for mediation and moderation-based path analysis that allows you to determine the significant or non-significant direct and indirect effects in your model. And the way that it does this is by providing 95% bootstrapped confidence intervals. So you'll often see a confidence interval like this associated with each of your direct and indirect effects in your model. And it'll just depend on how many pathways you have in your particular model. But the way you determine significance is by determining whether the confidence interval straddles 0 or not. So on the left, we have this example where the confidence interval does not include 0. So there you can determine that that pathway, whether it's an indirect effect or a direct effect, is significant. Compared to the example on the right that straddles 0, this one would not be significant. And for significant ones, they can go either positive or negative as long as it doesn't overlap with 0. So for our first set of analyses, we'll be looking at subjective age as a mediator. And this is just a theoretical model for demonstration purposes. We'll actually be testing each of these 3 outcomes as independent outcomes in the next few models. But basically what we're expecting here is that older adults who have more essentialist beliefs about aging should feel older. Having greater essentialist beliefs should also influence greater negative views of aging. And negative views of aging will also be influenced by subjective age. So older adults who feel older will be more likely to have increased negative views of aging. Okay, so in our first model, we're looking at fear of aging as an outcome and subjective age as a mediator. So here you can see that essentialist beliefs about aging are positively predicting fear of aging. So here, older adults who have these beliefs that aging is something that is fixed and locked in place are more likely to have these concerns about aging. And they're also more likely to feel older, which is then also associated with a greater fear of aging. Something I want to note here is that you'll notice the direct and indirect effect are significant. And in mediation, it's also common to have the direct effect not being significant. So in this case, what this means is that we have a partial mediation. So essentialist beliefs is still directly related to fear of aging rather than essentialist beliefs predicting fear of aging solely through subjective age. And this will be true for all of the mediation models that you'll see today. So in the next model, we have awareness of age-related losses as our outcome. And here, essentialist beliefs are once again directly predicting awareness of age-related losses. Essentialist beliefs are also predicting greater subjective age. And then feeling older is associated with this increased awareness of the losses that are associated with aging. We also have here age stigma consciousness as a potential outcome where, again, essentialist beliefs are positively associated with age stigma consciousness and, again, positively associated with subjective age. So older adults who are viewing aging as something that is fixed are more likely to feel older, and then that feeling older is associated with being more concerned about being stigmatized due to your older age identity. I'm sorry that some of these are cut off. They weren't like that in my original slides, but if you're interested in getting a copy of the slides after, I'd be more than happy to send that around. Okay, so just to summarize, we looked at essentialist beliefs as a predictor in each of these models, and we looked at the negative views of aging constructs as our outcomes. And here we saw that subjective age partially mediated all 3 of these relationships. So moving on to research question 2, we can assess how older adults' essentialist beliefs about aging, as well as their views about aging, predict their subjective age. So this is an interesting question because we can kind of see what the antecedents are, basically what is predicting subjective age, so what is influencing how old or young an older adult feels. So here what we're essentially doing is swapping subjective age from being our outcome, from being our mediator to being our outcome instead. Okay, so once again, this is just a theoretical model for demonstration, but what we can expect here is that essentialist beliefs should positively predict fear of aging, awareness of age-related losses, and age stigma consciousness. And it should also be associated with feeling older. And then feeling older should also be associated with having these negative views of aging. So in our first model here, looking at subjective age as an outcome and fear of aging as a mediator, we can see that essentialist beliefs are positively predicting subjective age. So older adults who believe aging is locked in place are more likely to feel older. They're also more likely to be worried about aging and the consequences that they perceive as being associated with aging, which is then associated with feeling older. In this model, we have awareness of age-related losses as our mediator, and here essentialist beliefs are once again still predicting subjective age, and this time also predicting the awareness of age-related losses. So older adults who have more essentialist beliefs are more likely to have this heightened awareness about the losses that are associated with their aging, as well as feeling older. And as you can see, that relationship between being aware of losses and subjective age is quite strong. Lastly, we can look at age stigma consciousness as a mediator. So here, essentialist beliefs are still predicting subjective age as an outcome, but they're also predicting age stigma consciousness. So older adults who have these essentialist beliefs are more likely to be worried about being stigmatized due to their age, which is then associated with feeling older. So just to sum up here, our predictor once again was consistently essentialist beliefs. And here we looked at mediators of negative views of aging and subjective age as our outcome. And once again, we saw significant mediation partially in all three models. So this brought us to the question of whether there is a stronger predictor of subjective age. So essentially, we have all three of these constructs that could potentially all significantly predict subjective age, but it's also possible that only one or two of them is a better predictor of subjective age. So the way that we can test that is through parallel multiple mediation, where we essentially force all of the different mediators to compete with each other. So by testing them as independent models, as we did previously, we're not acknowledging that there's shared variance between these constructs. So when we force them all to compete for that space in the same model, we can see if there's one or two potential constructs, perhaps even all three, that remain significant in predicting subjective age. So here we can see that essentialist beliefs are once again positively predicting each of these three negative views of aging constructs. So having these essentialist beliefs is associated with more awareness of age-related losses, a greater fear of aging, and age stigma consciousness. But what you'll notice here is that in terms of predicting subjective age, only awareness of age-related losses is now a significant predictor. So fear of aging and age stigma consciousness are no longer significantly predicting subjective age. So this really communicates that awareness of age-related losses was kind of the winner in terms of determining how old an older adult feels. So really what this means is that older adults who have this heightened awareness of the losses that are associated with their age are more likely to feel older. Yeah. This is all still at the same time, yeah. Yeah, so it's basically just all the same construct as previously, just being tested in a different way. Yeah, thank you. Okay. So we saw that essentialist beliefs were a consistent predictor in all of the models that we looked at. We also saw that subjective age was a consistent predictor as well as a consistent outcome of negative views of aging. And lastly, we saw that awareness of age-related losses was our strongest predictor of subjective age. So I think that these results really highlight the importance of trying to eliminate these negative views of aging, because that really is what seems to be driving older adults feeling older. And we know that subjective age is this really crucial area that can actually be associated with numerous health benefits. And so we can try focusing more on awareness of age-related gains instead. Yeah, question. Mm-hmm. The losses are items like as I age, I'm noticing that my memory is decreasing, I'm becoming more isolated from others. So there are a number of different items in there. Yeah. Yeah, I would say it's more about the individual's experience. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So to summarize, some older adults view aging as something that is fixed and locked in place, And this is associated with having this heightened awareness of age-related losses, such as noticing that your memory performance is declining. And this is associated with feeling older as measured by subjective age. And this is above and beyond effects of fear of aging or age stigma consciousness. Okay, I'm sorry so much of this is cut off. I'm not sure what happened. So we're going to move on to implicit views of aging, part of the second phase of our study. And in particular, we'll be looking at a lexical decision task. So as I mentioned previously, the second phase of our study was completed in the lab, where participants completed a very large battery of tests in about a 3-hour testing session. And one of the tests that they completed here was an implicit views of aging task, which was based as a lexical decision task. So if you're unfamiliar, a lexical decision task basically involves being presented with various words or strings of letters on a computer and having to decide whether the word that you're seeing is a real word or whether it's a nonsense word. So in this example here, this word frange is a nonsense word. This is not an actual word. But the important thing to note about the nonsense is that theoretically they could be words. They're all pronounceable. Any linguists in the room or online can please correct me if I'm wrong, but theoretically this could be a word. So this should kind of hinder response time in terms of having to go through this process in your head of thinking, okay, I can say this word, but it's not actually a word. So participants completed 186 trials, 10 of which were practice trials, where they make decisions about words that are associated with either stereotypes about older adults or younger adults, and this was all just sing words, and they're also presented with a series of non-words. One of 3 primes always appeared before each word, so in any given trial, the participant was first presented with a prime, so that was either old, young, or this X letter string, and they were then presented with their target word that they would have to make a decision about in terms of whether it was a word or a non-word. And this X letter string prime is mainly included just as a kind of control that shouldn't really be influencing how participants are responding to the following word. I'll walk you through the blocks that were composed, that composed the task. And this is not necessary to know from the participant's perspective, but I think it's helpful to just get an understanding of the block structure from the experimenter point of view. Sorry, this is all cut off. So block 1 was instructions and practice, but blocks 2 through 6 are where the important information is in terms of the stereotype and valence combination. So for example, in block 2, we had old positive words such as knowledgeable. In block 3, we had old negative words such as lonely. So blocks 2 and 3 are both old words, but it's important from the experimenter's point of view to determine whether the old word the participant was seeing was a positive word or a negative word, because that's something that we want to look at in our analyses. Block 4 was young positive words such as carefree, and block 5 was young negative words such as reckless, and then block 6 was our non-words such as frange. And it's important to note that these are not only words that appeared in these categories. There were a number of different words associated with each of the blocks, and participants actually saw each word 3 times, so it would be presented with each of the independent primes.
Yeah. So at the very beginning, they didn't see the word old. They just saw something was old positive or old negative. Like you talk old, young, or 3 X's. Did they actually see the word?
Yeah, so the prime flashes very briefly, and then they see what the target word is. We'll actually go through like what a trial looked like, just because I know it's a little bit complicated to just hear. Yeah. Okay, so just to orient you to where this task came from, so it's from a 2000 paper, 2002, written by my advisor and her colleagues, where they administered this exact task to both younger and older adults. And the graph that you're looking at here, what it's essentially showing you is prime type on the x-axis and reaction time on the y-axis, where here we're looking at an interaction between prime type and word type. So what you can see is that when when participants were presented with the old prime, that helped facilitate their responding for the old words, because that was kind of a consistent pairing. So if they saw the prime old and then they saw the word knowledgeable that really facilitate their responding because that stereotype of old and knowledgeable was activated. And we see a similar pattern for the young traits, where that young prime is also being facilitated in terms of facilitating responding for young words. And overall here, we're also seeing that on average, older words were responded to more quickly than younger words. In this next slide, what we're seeing is a main effect of valence. So overall, participants were quicker to respond to positive words than they were to negative words. Okay, so with this task, we ask a variety of questions. Mainly, more generally, we can look at how quick can participants categorize words based on prime type, of which there are 3 levels, stereotypicality, of which there are 2 levels, so whether the word was young or old, and also valence, so whether the word was positive or negative. So you can imagine, for example, that there might be a faster reaction time for the word lonely when old is presented compared to when the prime young is presented, because lonely and old might be viewed as a consistent prime and word type, whereas young and lonely might not be as strong of an association in someone's mind, and so that might hinder response time. Similarly, we might see a slower reaction time for the word carefree when old is presented as the prime compared to when young is presented as the prime, because people might not actively have the stereotype of carefree being associated with the category old. So to walk you through what a trial looks like, participants essentially were brought into the lab and they sat in front of a computer and our instructions appeared on the screen that basically just told them that they'd be seeing a variety of different things on the screen. So first they would see a plus sign, which was just the fixation cross to let them know where to attend to. And then they see a first word, which would flash quickly. And then they would see a second word, and they were told that they were supposed to make a decision about the second word in terms of whether it was a word or a non-word. And they were told if it's a word, you should press the yes key on the keyboard, and if it's not a word, you should press the no key. And we just had little stickers on the keyboard. So they weren't explicitly given instructions about anything to do with the prime. They were just told when the second word appears, that's when you should make your decision. So first they were presented with the fixation cross just for 300 milliseconds, followed by a blank screen for 500 milliseconds, and the prime here, young in this example, for 250 milliseconds, another blank screen for 50 milliseconds, and then here our target word knowledgeable appears and would remain on the screen until the participant makes a decision. So this is one of our old positive words, and what the program is doing as the participant is completing this task is it's recording whether they make a correct categorization of this word, so correctly identifying it as a word rather than a non-word, and also seeing how long they took to make that decision. So to go through the results, I'll first take you through the difference between words and non-words. So this is just an important first step in the lexical decision task to make sure that words and non-words were being interpreted differently by our participants, because non-words in this task are mainly included just as distractors. So analytically, they're not so important, but we just want to determine that participants are slower at identifying these non-words because, as I said previously, they're all pronounceable non-words, which makes them a little bit more difficult to detect as not being a word compared to just if it was a random jumble of letters, which would obviously not be a word. So as you can see here, we saw that words and non-words were being treated differently. So participants were quicker to respond to words than they were to non-words. So all of the analyses from this point forward will be relevant for words only. So in this slide, what you're seeing on the x-axis is prime type, so whether the prime was young, old, or the x letter string prime. And on the y-axis, you're seeing response time in milliseconds. And I just want to note here that I've truncated the y-axis, so it's not starting at 0. So just be mindful of that. I did that only because the differences are very hard to visualize when they're not presented this way. So unexpectedly, what we're seeing here is that older adults were slower to respond to words when the X letter string prime appeared compared to both young primes and old primes. And this was somewhat unexpected, but what's possible in terms of what's happening is that this prime is acting as a distractor for older adults. For some reason, it's slowing down their response time to the following word. And for our young and our old primes, we're not seeing any differences there in terms of one helping facilitate responses faster than the other. For stereotypicality, here we have word type on the x-axis, so whether the words were young or old. And what we see here, consistent with the 2002 paper, is that older adults were quicker to respond to old words than they were to young words. And this makes sense because people should be more familiar with the words that are associated with their group membership than words that are not. So they're more quickly identifying those old type words, which might be more associated with their own self-concept or knowledge of stereotypes about their group compared to the young type words. For valence, here we have positive and negative on the x-axis, and again, response time on the y-axis, where here we have, consistent with the 2002 paper again, older adults more quickly respond to positive words than they do to negative words. Okay, next we'll go through our interaction between stereotypicality and valence. So here on the x-axis, we have our young and old type words, where the dark blue bars are representing positive words and the light blue bars are representing negative words. So just to start, we have a difference in our young type words, where participants were slower to identify young negative words as being words compared to the young positive words. For old words, there was no difference between the two, so older adults could pretty quickly identify both old positive and old negative words as being words. And this makes sense because they might be more aware of both the positive and negative stereotypes associated with their own group membership as compared to the stereotypes associated with a group that they don't necessarily identify with. Our interaction is being driven by this difference here, where the young negative words overall had a slower response time compared to both old positive and old negative words. And we also see this for our young positive words, which also have a slower response time compared to our old positive and our old negative words. So in general here, participants took the longest amount of time to identify young negative words as words. And this is interesting because it kind of suggests that older adults don't have this strong association between the construct negative and the category young. So just to summarize, older adults were fairly quick at categorizing old type words, regardless of whether they were positive or negative, likely because they associate these words with being part of their group membership, regardless of whether they might actually identify with these words or not. They were a little bit slower when it came to identifying young type words and young positive words and young negative words. And this was particularly the case for the young negative words. So these young negative stereotypes were not as prominent of an association in the minds of our participants above and beyond young positive words or the old negative or old positive words. To summarize on prime type, so we didn't see that there was an effect where the old prime was facilitating responses for the old words. We also didn't see that the young prime was facilitating responses for young words. But unexpectedly, we saw that the X letter string prime was actually slowing down responses. And as I said previously, this was unexpected, but it's possible that this was just distracting older adults, although really it's only included as a control where we could reliably see whether old and young are differing from each other, and in this case, they weren't. No, so that was also used in the original 2002 paper, but I think the analyses didn't include the XXX prime. Am I right, Allison?
Yeah, the original paper, the evidence the standard kind of line control. That's not just why we had it in there, and it just felt like along with the number data, it just kind of fillers stuff around the trial, so that it much on the old prime conditions. And so we wanted the analyses
Yeah, I think in comparison, that original study was also probably quite a smaller sample in comparison.
Much
Yeah.
smaller sample. That one was collected in the late 90s for all of our current concerns about it. Those young ones are almost old now. Yeah, that's right, 20 years on. And the other thing that we didn't bother to mention about the differences we were interested in trying to get it automatic versus controlled processing in the past. So some people had a very fast voice here at the same time, speed and rate of presentation, and other people saw the time for a much longer period of time. So we saw the word old and young or XXX for over a second. And then the target came on. We wanted to see would they respond differently in time category. Turns out that didn't matter. And so again, this graph kind of showed collapse across how long the time to show collapse across participant age. It's a bit of a different mix.
Yeah, I think really the difference in including older and younger participants is what's driving this finding in this particular set of analyses, because I think there's a pretty robust set of literature that shows that older adults are fairly prone to distractors. So it could be possible that if we had younger adults in the sample, that it could have just canceled out. But here, because we had, I think, over 300 older adults complete this task, it could have been perceived as distracting. And this is also, these tasks were administered at the very end of like a 2 or 3 hour session, so they could have been fairly tired already. Yeah. Okay, so the last set of results that I'll talk to you about today are from another implicit task, and here we looked at an implicit association task. So the implicit association task, if you're unfamiliar, is a fairly famous cognitive behavioral measure to look at how strongly people associate certain constructs with each other. So you might be familiar with the classic race IAT or white-black IAT, as it's sometimes referred to, where participants are presented with a series of white and black faces and the categories good or bad. So for the faces, they're seeing white and black faces, and for the words, they're seeing words that are good or bad, so words that can be associated with either of those categories. So for bad, they might see the word horrible, or for good, they might see a word like lovely. And essentially, participants have to categorize whether the face or the word that they're seeing belongs to a particular category. So in the example on the left, this participant is presented with a black face that they would then categorize into the category on the right, black or good. And in the example on the right, the participant is seeing a white face that would go into the category white or good. And here you'll notice that these categorizations flip. So sometimes participants are seeing white or good or white or bad, and the same is true for the black category. So what is typically seen in this type of task is that participants have a preference for white. So what will happen is that they're much quicker to categorize white when it appears with good and black when it appears with bad due to stereotypes about black individuals. A very similar version of this task exists for age, and so you can picture almost an essentially identical task where instead of white and black faces, we have pictures of older adults and younger adult faces, where again they're being categorized with these good and bad type words, where you see a similar pattern where people are quicker to associate young when it appears with good and old when it appears with bad due to our age-based stereotypes. So we administered a similar task, but we used the brief version of the IAT, which you can read more about in this NOSEC 2014 paper. But as the name implies, the brief IAT is very short. It only takes about 5 minutes to administer, which is what we were looking for at the end of like a 2 or 3 hour session where people don't want to complete another button clicking task. And so in this version of the task, like the classic age IAT, we had young and old faces, and these are taken directly from the existing age IAT that you can access on the Millisecond website for EXPLICIT software. But instead of presenting participants with the classic good or bad type words, what we presented them with were self or other words. So they saw words like me, my, mine, and self for self words, and them, they, their, and other for other words. And what this can measure is the degree to which older adults are associating young with the self as opposed to associating old with the self. So just to walk you through the instructions, participants were told that they would see a series of words and pictures of faces. They were instructed that when they see self words, they should always press the green key, when was just on the keyboard that we like taped over with some green paper. And when you see young faces, you should also press the green key. Press the red key when you see other words or old faces, and sometimes this will change and you'll press the green key for old faces, but you'll be reminded of when it switches. And they're also told to go as quickly as they can while making as few mistakes as possible, and when they make a mistake, they'll be asked to correct it. So for the first set of trials, it reminds them that they're going to be responding for the category young or self. So it shows them all of the possible faces that they could see for young faces, as well as all the possible words that they could see for self words. And again, they're instructed to press the green key if they see either faces or words from these categories. So in this trial here, we have a young face. So the correct response here would be to press the green key because this face is associated with the category young or self. In this case, the participant was presented again with a young face, but here they incorrectly identified this face as not being part of the category young or self, so they would have pressed the red key here. And when this happens, the program lets them know that they've made a mistake by presenting them with this X, and they're basically asked to correct their mistake before they can move on to the next trial. In this example, the participant is presented with an other word. So in this case, the correct response would be to press the red key because this word is neither associated with the category young nor self. So for the results, the way that the implicit association task works is that based on the response time and accuracy of all of the trials, it calculates a single D score, which ranges from -2 to +2, where 0 would essentially indicate no preference. And in our task in particular, a positive D score of +2 would be associated with having that stronger preference or association for young with the self, and a D score of -2 would be associated with having a preference or more of an association for old self. So for our results, you can see that the average D score was 0.21, and overall participants were more in that positive range of D scores. So overall, our participants were associating young more with the self than they were associating old with the self. But something else that I think is interesting to note is that is the range of scores. So you'll see that on the negative end, we approach -2 more closely at 1.65 than we do at the positive end. We're just at 1.3. I think it was nearly 60 to like 90 plus. I would have to double check the age range of the participants who actually came into the lab because I'm not 100% sure on that. Yeah, I think the mean age was always around 70. Yeah, 71. Yeah. So overall, what we're seeing from this task is that older adults are associating young more with the self than they are associating old with the self. And this is kind of interesting because it lines up with some of what we've been thinking about in terms of subjective age. So older adults are implicitly or automatically having this stronger association for young self over old self. Although I can tell you that not every older adult was happy about this. So at the end of the task, it would actually show them like, oh, your D score is this, and you have a preference for self young. But we got feedback that some people didn't like that, so we actually took that out of the task. So they weren't seeing that anymore to avoid people becoming upset with associating young more with the self than old with the self. And one thing that we could do from here, just in an exploratory way, even though implicit and explicit views are typically not correlated, what we could do is see whether there is a correlation here between our D score and subjective age. So we could imagine that there might be a negative association where a higher D score, so associating young more with the self, could be associated with feeling younger, so having a lower subjective age. So just to walk you through some next steps, we're currently in the process of bringing some older adults back into the lab just to complete some hearing tasks because we were having issues with our hearing test technology. But once we finish this step, we can look at a similar set of questions as was presented in the first paper at the beginning of the talk, essentially looking at the relationship between negative views of aging as well as perceived and actual abilities. And from there, select older adults have been recruited for an intervention to hopefully foster more positive views about aging. And from here, we can assess longitudinally whether we can target older adults' views about aging and make them more positive, and whether those improvements are also associated with other outcomes, such as health outcomes or memory and cognition outcomes. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for listening and thank my collaborators and the CCNA for sponsoring this work. And with this talk, I hope that I've convinced you of the harms that are associated with negative views of aging, and hopefully we can start viewing aging as something that is more positive and as the fun part of life instead. Thank you.
Question, do you know if there's any research looking at beliefs and mediators, such as you've been doing, with how that correlates with frailty?
Well, like physical frailty?
Frailty has a subjective point. I mean, there are obvious physical signs when someone is considered frail, I mean, categories, but how people get to that point, how much is actually attitudinal, and how much is physical?
It's a good question. I'm just...
There's a certain amount of believing you're frail makes you frail to some extent.
Yeah.
It's not just a medical thing that happens.
The only thing that I can think of that's relevant to your question is there's some work basically looking at different, like what's correlated with subjective age, similar to what we've been doing here. And some work has found that older adults who are actually like more ill will have a lower discrepancy between their actual chronological age and their subjective age. So there's been work showing that on average, people feel about 13 years younger than their actual age, and that's consistent as they continue to age, that 13 years younger number. But that discrepancy decreases the more that participants are actually physically ill. Although I guess that could be associated with physical frailty, but I'm not 100% sure what illness was categorized as in that particular paper. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah.
When you were going to the first paper and it came to the end of the essentialist beliefs, I can't remember if you had it at the beginning, but did you have a slide of what was measured?
In the essentialist beliefs? I do have that. Yeah. So this was just, yeah. I promise I didn't plant her in the audience. Yeah, so this, I can't access my notes here, so I can't remember if this is all of the items or not. It's really short, yeah. So here I can read them out if it's a little bit C. So the first item is, to a large extent, a person's age biologically determines his or her abilities. So that would be more of an essentialist belief. Aging is an irreversible biological process and cannot be influenced. Age is just a number and doesn't say much about a person. So that would be a reverse scored item. And no matter at what point in life, you can always influence your own aging. So that's another reverse scored item. Yeah, usually these essentialist beliefs and mindsets measures are like fairly short, just with a couple reverse coded items and then regular items. Yeah. Thank you.
So it was fascinating, and I think one of the big advantages of being at the Institute is that I get exposure to different fields looking at things differently, and it was just fabulous and very professionally done, and it was really especially out of your back pocket you could pull those at the last second. So we do want to thank you so much, and you did a fantastic job.
Thank you so much for having me.
And those of you here,
I'll let you.
feedback from the members.
I'll just